Hello, David.
Hey, Kim.
So we're here talking about the history of the Republican Party of the United States of America.
Because as we're sitting here recording this, the Republican National Convention is going to be happening in just a few short weeks. And so we wanted to get some context on the history of the party and really understand where it emerged, where the symbol of the elephant comes from, and when Lincoln enters the picture.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think we frequently have this sense that the United States has always had a two-party system, that there's always been the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and they've always kind of been polar opposites who are in struggle for power in the United States. But each of these parties has its own unique, interesting history that kind of springs up from a specific context in time. And here we want to talk about the context of the Republican Party.
So around the time that the Republican Party was created, which, Kim, is in approximately what year?
I would say 1854.
So not even approximately.
Yes.
So in 1854, when the Republican Party emerges, what are the other prominent political parties in the United States?
All right, so there's no Republican Party before 1854. The major political parties are the Democrats, and that's the same Democratic Party that we have today. Their history goes back to...
So like 1820s,
yeah,
right?
It's Jackson. And then there are also the Whigs, and they're kind of a progressive party. They're in favor of internal improvements, tariffs to protect businessmen, centralized banking. So they're a progressive party.
I'm sorry I giggled at that, but Whigs is just such a funny word, and it seems like the sort of name that they wouldn't have chosen for their own party.
You think so?
Right?
Well, they're trying to kind of throw back to an earlier era where the Whigs were those who had actually rebelled against the British. So it has this kind of revolutionary connotation.
I see.
There are also the Free Soil Party, and these are folks who are particularly interested in making sure that the institution of slavery doesn't spread west of where it already exists in the American South. They want to make sure that new territories do not come in as slave states.
So this was my confusion, because my understanding of the history of the Republican Party is that it was founded as an abolitionist party, right? That it was anti-slavery. And you're telling me that the Free Soilers are also anti-slavery, but to a different degree.
Right. Well, I would say that the Republican Party itself is also anti-slavery. And here we need to make an important distinction between abolitionism and anti-slavery. So abolitionists, before really the mid-1850s, the abolitionists would have been considered kind of the lunatic fringe.
Okay.
They're a relatively small minority, particularly based in New England, who believed that the American institution of slavery needed to be ended right now.
So they're for the immediate eradication of slavery, like expunging the practice from the continent.
Exactly. And that means no slavery in the states of the South. They think that slavery is morally wrong. They want slavery to be ended immediately.
I mean, sounds good to me now in the 21st century.
Yeah. Comparatively, anti-slavery advocates, they said that they weren't sure if slavery should exist. They didn't know if it was constitutionally acceptable for the president or the Congress to end the practice of slavery where it already existed. Remember, people thought of this often in terms of property rights. But they sure knew that what they didn't want was slavery to spread to the West. Now, this was not because most of them were particularly nice people who were thinking, maybe if slavery doesn't spread to the West, then the institution of slavery will eventually die out. I mean, some people certainly thought that way. But
what was their rationale behind it?
Their real rationale was they thought, all right, all of these Southern white slaveholders, they're incredibly wealthy. If we allow slavery in these territories, those men are going to move out to the West. They're going to buy up huge amounts of land, and they're going to work that land with enslaved people. So if I'm an ordinary white farmer coming from Michigan, say, and I want to move out to Kansas, Nebraska, somewhere in the West, and start a farmstead, I'm never going to be able to compete with someone who has that much land and free labor on top of it.
Interesting.
So they want to make sure that the West is open for kind of your average white farmer.
That really puts the Homestead Act in context for me.
Exactly, yeah. And it's going to be the Republicans who passed the Homestead Act, which makes a lot of sense.
So, I mean, real quick, not to take us down this journey too far, but can we review what the Homestead Act is and how it works?
Sure. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862. And it was an act that said if you moved out west, you were entitled to a certain tract of land, which you would get for free.
Right.
And
like 160 acres?
Yeah,
does that sound right?
I think that sounds right. And as long as you improved that land, say, planted an orchard on it, grew some crops, built a barn and a house, that land was yours for free. So this is a big stimulus for Western expansion.
Sure. And you could also argue that it might have been something to appease free soilers, right? Former free soilers.
Right. So we're getting to the part here where the Republican Party actually emerges. In 1854, there is a landmark piece of legislation which comes about in Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
What did it do?
The Kansas-Nebraska Act said that when settlers moved to one of these territories, Kansas, Nebraska, when applying for statehood themselves, be able to decide whether or not their state would allow slavery. So this was called popular sovereignty, right? It would be the sovereignty of the people, however they voted, that decided whether their state was going to be a free state or a slave state. Now, this invalidated previous compromises like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which said that slavery wouldn't be allowed in territories north of a certain parallel. So this means that people in the North are super upset, and it ends up breaking apart the Whig Party because they can't decide whether or not they're for or against this idea of popular sovereignty for letting people decide themselves whether there should be slavery in their new state.
Well, this seems like a moment of great moral urgency. That, this Kansas-Nebraska Act seems like it would force a lot of people to make sudden political decisions.
It does. It's kind of one of these moments of real political realignment because now you've got Whigs who are originally a national party divided between people in the South who might say, yeah, I think actually you should be able to decide. Whereas Whigs in the North might say, wait, we already solved this. We had a compromise about this. We were not going to allow slavery this far north. So the Whigs end up falling apart. And in response to this Kansas-Nebraska Act, the new Republican Party is formed.
And do we have any insight into why it's called the Republican Party?
Yeah, so they're thinking about the ideas that Thomas Jefferson had. And remember, he was one of the founders of the United States, the author of the Declaration of Independence. And the United States itself is a republic. We would say a small r republic, which means a nation where individuals, citizens take on the burdens of leadership. There's no such thing as a hereditary aristocracy. They believe in individual liberty and responsibilities.
So they're trying to return to the classical roots of the American Republic. By calling themselves this, they're trying to return to the ideals of Rome that Jefferson wrought the Declaration of Independence from. Is that kind of the notion behind it?
Yeah, and there's a strong idea of individual liberty here.
Okay.
And they also really wanted to end slavery. So I would say they're anti-slavery, maybe not so far as abolitionists, but as they go through the course of the Civil War, which becomes a contest about the fate of slavery, and thereafter, their core constituency is going to truly believe in ending slavery and ensuring rights for freed people.
So if some of the Whigs became Republicans, where did the rest of the Whigs go?
Oh, some of them retired from politics altogether, and many of them also joined the Democratic Party. There was also a short-lived party called the Constitutional Union Party for people who were afraid that the Union was going to split up, which it ended up doing in late 1860.
But you were saying there haven't always been just two major parties either, right? There was a whole ecosystem of other political parties in the United States at this time as well.
Yeah, and those parties will kind of come in and come out over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And even today, we have other political parties beyond Democratic and Republican, but few third parties have the kind of reach that a party like the Republican Party might have had in 1856 when they fielded their first candidate for president.
And who was that?
That fellow was a man named John C. Fremont. And even though Fremont did not win the presidential election of 1856, he came in second, which is amazing.
Wow. So this party was kind of an insurgent party that came out of nowhere and suddenly swept. But it didn't take first place, but it did get a significant vote share.
Yeah, can you imagine founding a party today that 2 years from now would take second place in a presidential election? That's amazing.
I mean, I could probably do it.
So John C. Fremont does not win the presidency, but shows that the Republican Party is a major force in American politics.
When does Lincoln come into the picture?
I'm glad you asked. So Lincoln emerges in 1860, and you can see that my timeline is not very true to scale here. But in 1860, the Republican Party runs Abraham Lincoln as its presidential candidate. And for them, Lincoln is actually kind of a moderate candidate. So the most famous Republican was William Seward, but he was considered kind of a fanatic that would not be electable at a national scale. So Lincoln becomes their candidate. And in November of 1860, he's elected president of the United States.
Everything sounds good. Sounds great. Everything's going to be great for the United States now on.
Well, now we know that Lincoln is an anti-slavery candidate, but he was perceived by many whites in the South as being an abolitionist, and they thought, all right, here it comes. He is going to end slavery. We've got to get out. So they use Lincoln's election as the moment to exit the American Union and form the Confederate States of America. Now, this is going to go on for a 4-year-long war where more than 620,000 Americans die. And at the end of it, the Union, led by the Republican Party, is triumphant. And from that point forward, the Republican Party is really going to be the strongest political party in the United States for most of the balance of the 19th century and considerable amounts of the early 20th century. They work hard to develop the United States through railroads and...
Because this is when we see the Transcontinental Railroad emerge, right? Is around like 1865?
Yep. So they're building railroads. They're ensuring protections for American business and really allowing the American economy and industry to grow. And it's in 1870 that Thomas Nast.
Yeah, I was wondering when we'd get to this picture.
Who was a famous cartoonist, a really influential cartoonist. He popularizes this idea of the Republican Party as an elephant. So it's a party of strength.
Okay.
But he also here in this cartoon is saying this is a really huge, important, and strong party, but they might get frightened easily, like an elephant is kind of a giant beast that might make poor decisions when frightened.
So this brings us up to around like 1912, right?
That's right, when Wilson is put into office, and that's partly because the Republican Party splits that year. So Wilson is really one of the first Democrats elected. There were a handful elected to the presidency in this period of Republican ascendancy. Because this time period, they often said that Republicans would wave the bloody shirt, which meant they'd say, you caused the Civil War, Democrats, because Democrats were a strong party of power in the South. So they'd say, you should follow the Republicans because we were the martyrs of the Civil War, like Abraham Lincoln was the martyr of the Civil War, assassinated in 1865. And so this is really the great period of Republican ascendancy in 19th century America.
Cool.